Hello. As the director of the Salzland Museum, I would like to welcome you here to the Pömmelte Woodhenge. I'm standing in the archaeological reconstruction of a circular earthwork. I would like to introduce you to this significant place, its history, and its extraordinary finds.
The sensational discovery of the Nebra sky disk had put a spotlight on a mostly unexplored era in central Germany, the Early Bronze Age. But what kind of sacred sites did men build 4,000 years ago? Scientists theorize that the cultures of the Late Stone Age and Early Bronze Age created circular sites. Nobody knows from which eras they originated and whether they could help to disclose the secrets of the sky disk. 12 circular earthworks were already known in Saxony-Anhalt from earlier reconnaissance flights. In 2005, the archaeologist Dr. André Spazier was hired to examine these sites.
We had 12 of these circular earthworks, which we considered worthy of research. We started with smaller excavations to determine their age. Immediately, the first excavation proved that the Pömmelte site was the most promising location. It would allow us to gather information about how a sacred site and the rituals celebrated there might have looked.
The Woodhenge Pömmelte is situated on a slight elevation of ground between the rivers Elbe and Saale. The outer circle of wooden posts has a diameter of 115 meters. A ring of pits, a rampart and a trench proceed towards the center. The interior space is shielded by a palisade. The Woodhenge was built during the 3rd millennium before Christ, the same time frame as Stonehenge and the pyramids in Egypt. 3 different cultures were located here in the course of about 800 years.
The extraordinary feature of Pömmelte is the fact that here we can prove that at this location a sacred construction was continuously used during an era of change from one culture to the next. This is completely unprecedented.
The first burial mound was presumably built about 4,800 years ago by people of the corded ware culture, which was part of the battle axe culture. About 500 years later, the bell beaker culture built the large Woodhenge on top of this small site. The people of this culture changed their habits later on. The change can be seen by their vessels, whose shapes and decorations gradually develop into the characteristics of the Untitled culture.
It's obvious that this site was not standing isolated in the wilderness, but that larger settlements existed next to it. It's not a sacred site standing on its own in a vast empty area, but people who probably looked after it lived next to it.
The shape of a very large longhouse in this settlement is especially impressive. It was reconstructed as a model according to archaeological discoveries.
Pömmelte is especially important because we can prove the practice of rituals. Much better here than in Stonehenge or with the Nebra sky disk. According to the finds and the location, it's simple to see and to reconstruct this site as a place of rituals.
This is made possible by the discovery of 29 offering pits in Pömmelte. These pits were always filled in the same sequence, over an unprecedented period of 300 years. The lowest level consisted of broken ceramics, animal bones, millstones, and human skeletons. These deposits were sealed, often with millstones.
And up to 300 years later, someone returns to the very same spot, redigs the hole, this time less deep, and puts something in the hole. In this case, a stone axe or a single human skull. These are deposited in exactly the same spot where 300 years earlier other offerings were deposited.
The scientists especially marveled at the lower levels of these pits. The skeletons found there differ greatly from the honor burials of the early Bronze Age men. The scientists found remains of 7 women and children in the pits. They belonged to the same clan, and they were probably human offerings.
Here we have 2 skulls found in the pits. In total, 7 skulls were found. We can assume that they were not buried, but thrown into the hole as offerings. We can clearly see that the bones have marks and indentations, traumas that show they were hit with this kind of stone axe. You can see that clearly on this skull of a child, about 4 to 7 years old, and on this skull of a woman, 30 to 40 years old. Further skeleton parts were found, such as a rib cage with broken ribs, which means that the person was hit several times and died from these injuries.
The dead bodies of the Woodhenge show how close life and death, cult and everyday life were entwined. The reconstructed Woodhenge Pömmelte makes a Stone Age cosmos visible.
And all of a sudden, the overall combination becomes evident. The Woodhenge is a burial ground. It follows astrological directions. It's a place of offerings, ceremonies, rituals, a cultic place with cultic activities. Adding up all these elements, we realize that it was not only a place of ritual, but something we can really call a sacred site, a kind of Stone Age cathedral.
The scientists explain this cathedral theory with the different levels of meaning of the site. Celebrations relating to the sun and agricultural rituals can be proved in Pömmelte. The 2 opposite gateways in the southeast and northwest mark sunrise and sunset at the times of planting and harvest. The henge forms a dividing line from the outside world visible from afar. We can see various areas where public ceremonies and non-public rituals took place. Therefore, we can call them controlled spaces. The offerings found in Pömmelte were deposited in a circular trench. The traces show that the shape of the circle itself represented an image of their worldview. As circles of growing and decaying, of sanctification and sacrifice. In this image of the world, men and women held different positions. Therefore, in the northeastern area, mostly millstones were deposited. Millstones are connected to the female qualities of fertility. In the southeastern area, stone axes were found which are definitely connected to male activities. The last level of meaning of the henge is the realm of the dead. Most probably human sacrifices were buried next to honor burials of young men in the henge. They indicate complex rituals of death. We also found very clear traces of the last large ceremony taking place at the henge, its ritualistic destruction.
The last thing happening here was the dismantling of the sacred site, which can be imagined as a kind of ritual, symbolic burial. All the wooden posts were pulled out, burned, and the remains were buried in the trenches, where we discovered a thick layer of wood ashes, only explainable with the burning of huge amounts of wood.
Even today, we can well imagine the atmosphere of this sacred space in Pömmelte. To the exterior, the henge reflects power and intimacy. In its interior, life and spirituality merged to a polymorph image of the world. A Stone Age cathedral, only gradually revealing its secrets to the scientists.